October 17th. The date hung in the damp, northwest England air, thick and heavy as the rain that hadn't stopped for 3 days. It slicked the cobblestones of Ellie's narrow street, drummed a relentless rhythm on the slate roof, and blurred the world beyond her rain-streaked bay window into a watercolor smear of gray and green. Inside, the air felt still. Too still. Stale with the scent of old tea bags, and dust settling on things untouched. A year. Exactly 1 year since David. Since the quiet hospital room, the beeping machines falling silent, the impossible finality of his hand growing cold in hers. And exactly 1 year since Marnie vanished. Ellie sat in her worn armchair, the one facing the empty space where David's recliner used to be. Just a pale rectangle on the rug now. A ghost imprint. She traced the rim of her cold teacup, her own wedding band catching the weak afternoon light filtering through the clouds. It felt loose now, a constant, gentle reminder of the weight she'd lost, the life that had shrunk around her. The house was too big, full of echoes. David's laugh trapped in the beams, the phantom scent of his pipe tobacco sometimes catching her off guard. The silence where Marnie's soft trill used to greet her at the door. Marnie. Her little shadow. A scrappy tortoiseshell with fur like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind, oranges, blacks, and creams swirling chaotically. David had found her 6 years ago, a shivering, half-drowned scrap huddled under a dripping hedge on his way home from work. "Look at this fierce little survivor, he'd said, his eyes crinkling, holding out the sodden bundle wrapped in his jumper. She'd been all eyes, huge, wary amber pools in a tiny, pointed face. And a purr like a rusty hinge, loud and sudden, the moment Ellie touched her. She wasn't a cuddly cat, Marnie. Not overtly. She'd never curl on laps. But she was there, always, perched on the arm of David's chair while he read, blinking slowly at him. Padding silently into the kitchen the moment Ellie opened the fridge, her little nose twitching. Sleeping at the foot of their bed, a warm, vibrating lump under the duvet. She was their quiet witness, their shared, undemanding companion through lazy Sundays, tense work weeks, the quiet joy of simply being together. Her loyalty was fierce, silent, and utterly constant. Until the day after David died. The house was full then, hushed voices, the clatter of kindly meant casseroles, the suffocating scent of lilies. Ellie was numb, moving through the motions like a sleepwalker. She'd last seen Marnie that morning, sitting statue still on the windowsill in their bedroom, staring out at the rain, her tail wrapped tightly around her paws. Ellie remembered stroking her head, feeling the tiny skull beneath the fur, the purr absent. Just a deep, silent vibration. Then, she was gone. No dramatic exit. Just absence. A food bowl untouched. The cat flaps swinging emptily in the wind. They searched, leaflets plastered on rain-sodden lampposts, calls made to shelters, walks through the dripping woods behind the house, Ellie's voice growing hoarse calling her name. Nothing. The consensus, unspoken but heavy, settled. Marnie had simply grieved herself away. Disappeared into the gray October mist, taking another piece of Ellie's shattered heart with her. So now, October 17th again. Ellie sat in the quiet. The rain intensified, hammering now. The light was fading early, casting long, lonely shadows across the room. The anniversary of loss doubled. She felt it like a physical ache, a hollow beneath her ribs where warmth used to reside. She touched her wedding ring again, spinning it absently on her finger. A habit born of anxiety, or perhaps just the need to feel something solid, something that remained. David's ring. The thought was a fresh stab. His ring was gone too, lost in the frantic, awful chaos of those final hospital days. She'd searched pockets, laundry, retraced steps, but it had vanished, another precious thing swallowed by the void. Its absence felt like a final, cruel punctuation mark. A sudden, sharp rattle cut through the drumming rain. The cat flap. Ellie froze, teacup halfway to her lips. Her heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs. It happened sometimes, the wind catching it just right, making that plastic clatter. Hope was a dangerous thing, a frayed thread she couldn't afford to grasp anymore. She held her breath anyway, listening so intently the blood roared in her ears. Only the rain answered. Relief, or was it disappointment? Washed over her, cold and familiar. She slumped back into the chair, the worn fabric sighing under her weight. Just the wind. Always just the wind. Then the sound. Not the flap. Something else. Soft. Wet. A low, strained mew. It came from the other side of the back door, barely audible over the downpour. Ellie's head snapped up. Every nerve ending sparked to life. Impossible. It was the wind playing tricks, a neighbor's cat, wishful thinking screaming in her ears. But her body moved before her mind could argue, pushing her up from the chair, legs stiff, heart hammering a frantic tattoo now. She crossed the small, dim kitchen, linoleum cold under her bare feet. The back door had a glass panel at the top, obscured by condensation and rivulets of rain. Ellie wiped a trembling hand across the wet glass, peering out into the gloom of her tiny, rain-lashed yard. Twilight had deepened to near darkness. The outline of the wheelie bin, the skeletal shape of the old apple tree, the glistening wet flagstones. And huddled against the bottom step, pressed into the scant shelter of the overhanging porch, a shape. Small, dark, utterly still. It looked like a pile of sodden rags. Discarded. Lifeless. Ellie's breath hitched. Please, not just some stray, not just some poor creature, but then, the shape moved. Just a fraction. A slow, painful lift of the head. 2 points of reflected light, faint and greenish, glowed in the shadows. Unblinking. Fixed directly on her face through the glass. Ellie's hand flew to her mouth. A choked sound escaped her, half sob, half gasp. It couldn't be. A you? In this weather? The shape was too thin, too ragged. But the eyes, that intense, unwavering amber stare, even dulled by exhaustion and rain, it held a familiarity that punched straight through her disbelief. A memory flashed, Marnie, tiny and drenched in David's jumper, looking up with that same fierce, wary gaze. Without thought, fumbling, Ellie scrabbled for the deadbolt, her fingers numb and clumsy. It grated open with a rusty shriek. She pulled the heavy door back, a gust of wet, cold air rushing in, carrying the smell of earth and decay. Rain lashed across the threshold. The shape on the step flinched, a low, rasping hiss escaping it, more vibration than sound. It tried to shrink further back, pressing its skeletal body flat against the wet stone. Ellie dropped to her knees, ignoring the icy damp soaking through her trousers. She leaned forward slowly, hand outstretched, palm down unthreatening. "Hello," she whispered, her voice thick with tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Little one? Are you?" She couldn't say the name. Not yet. It was too fragile, too impossible. The cat didn't move towards her. Didn't flee either. Just watched, those huge, haunted eyes fixed on Ellie's face, unblinking. The rain plastered its fur flat, revealing the terrifying sharpness of its spine, the jutting points of its hips. It was a skeleton wrapped in muddy, matted fur. Tortoiseshell fur. Swirls of orange, black, and dirty cream, barely recognizable under the grime in the dark. One ear had a familiar, ragged notch, a souvenir from a long-ago scrap. Ellie's breath caught again, a ragged inhale. Oh God, please. She inched her hand closer, slowly, slowly, until her fingertips were just inches from the cat's trembling nose. It flinched again, but didn't retreat further. A tremor ran through its entire frame, violent, uncontrollable. Not just cold, but utter exhaustion, depletion. Lifted its chin, a fraction, sniffing the air near Ellie's fingers. A weak, questioning sound, almost a sigh, escaped it. And then Ellie saw it. Something small and startlingly bright, glinting dully against the wet, dark fur of the cat's chest, just below its chin. Caught, or perhaps deliberately held, in the tangled, matted hair. Something metallic, circular, a flash of pale gold in the gloom. Her gaze snapped from the object to the cat's face, then back. Her own hand, her own wedding ring, felt suddenly cold, heavy. Her mind stuttered, refusing to process, refusing to believe. The rain beat down. The wind moaned around the corner of the house. The world narrowed to this wet step, this broken creature, and that impossible, glinting thing tangled in its fur. The cat, Marnie, just stared back, those ancient amber eyes holding hers, filled with a depth of suffering and something else, something unreadable, that made Ellie's heart clench like a fist. This wasn't a triumphant return. This was a shipwreck survivor crawling onto a desolate shore. But she was here. Against all odds, against the rain and the years and the crushing weight of grief, she was here. Ellie's outstretched hand trembled violently. Not reaching for the glinting object, not yet. Reaching for the cat. For the ghost of warmth, the echo of a purr, the shadow that had walked beside her life and vanished into the storm. A single warm tear tracked through the rain on her own cheek as her fingertips finally gently brushed against the cold, wet fur of Marnie's bony head. The contact was electric. A spark in the suffocating gloom. A tiny, fractured purr, more vibration than sound, like stones grating deep in the cat's chest, answered her touch. It wasn't joy. Not yet. It was exhaustion, recognition, a fragile thread reconnecting across an impossible distance. The quiet shift wasn't in the world. It was deep within Ellie, a tectonic plate of frozen grief cracking, just a hairline fracture, letting in the first, faint, terrifying glimmer of something else. Something that felt dangerously like the beginning. Ellie's fingertip met cold, rain-slicked fur, the tiny skull beneath terrifyingly sharp. The rasping purr vibrated up her arm, a broken engine struggling to turn over. And those eyes, amber pools reflecting the dim kitchen light, held hers with an intensity that stole her breath. Not fear, exactly, not anymore. Something deeper, older. A recognition that bypassed thought and went straight to the marrow. Marnie. The name finally formed in Ellie's mind, solid and undeniable, shattering the fragile dam of disbelief. This skeletal ghost, this creature scraped raw by a year of wilderness, was her shadow. David's fierce little survivor, returned from the void. Her gaze flickered back to the small, metallic glint tangled in the dark, matted fur below Marnie's chin. Pale gold, circular, impossible. It couldn't be. David's ring, lost in the sterile chaos of the hospital, vanished like smoke. Yet here it was, nestled against the bony chest of the cat who vanished the day after he died. The coincidence was too vast, too cruel, or too miraculous to comprehend. Ellie's mind reeled, a kaleidoscope of grief, shock, and a terrifying, fragile hope. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. The ring could wait. This trembling, half-dead creature, this demanded every ounce of her focus. "All right, little love," Ellie whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears that mingled with the rain on her cheeks. "All right, let's get you in. Out of this wet." She kept her movements slow, deliberate, telegraphing her intentions. She slid her hands gently, oh so gently, beneath Marnie's frail body. The cat felt impossibly light, a bundle of damp twigs wrapped in ragged velvet. No resistance, just a shuddering sigh, a complete surrender to exhaustion so profound it felt like death itself. Ellie cradled the fragile weight against her chest, the cold wetness immediately soaking through her jumper. The scent hit her, a complex, awful bouquet, wet earth, decay, the sharp tang of infection, and beneath it, faintly, the dusty, sun-warmed fur scent she remembered. It was the smell of a year of suffering. She stood, legs trembling not just from kneeling, but from the sheer emotional weight now pressed against her heart. The kitchen felt suddenly cavernous, too bright, too exposed. Ellie moved quickly, kicking the back door shut against the lashing rain. The familiar warmth of the house felt alien now, charged with the presence of this returned ghost. She carried Marnie straight to the utility room, a small, tiled space off the kitchen with the washing machine and dryer, easier to clean, warmer than the vast living room. She laid a thick, clean towel on the cool floor tiles, then, with infinite care, placed Marnie down. The cat didn't move, just lay there, a collapsed heap of fur and bone, eyes half closed, breathing shallow and rapid. The glint of gold was stark against the dirty fur. Ellie forced herself to look away. Survival first. Questions later. She filled a bowl with lukewarm water, found the softest, cleanest washcloth she owned, and knelt beside the trembling form. "Just cleaning you up a bit, sweetheart," she murmured, more to calm her own racing heart than the cat. "Just getting some of this muck off." She dipped the cloth, wrung it almost dry, and gently, so gently, began wiping the mud and rain from Marnie's face. The cat flinched at the first touch, a tiny, involuntary jerk, but didn't hiss or pull away. Those amber eyes just watched her, unblinking, wary but resigned. Ellie worked with trembling hands, clearing the grime from around Marnie's eyes, her nose, the familiar notch in her ear. The fur beneath the filth was still the chaotic swirl of tortoiseshell, though dull and lifeless. She moved down the neck, carefully avoiding the area where the ring was tangled, her touch feather-light over protruding vertebrae. Marnie's skin felt stretched taut over the sharp architecture of starvation. Ellie's throat tightened. What horrors had this tiny creature endured? The ring. It was impossible to ignore forever. As Ellie gently cleaned the fur on Marnie's chest, her fingers inevitably brushed against the cold metal. It sent a jolt through her, like touching a live wire connected directly to her grief. She paused, took a shaky breath, and with infinite delicacy, used the corner of the washcloth to work at the matted fur surrounding it. The ring wasn't just caught, it seemed almost woven in, tangled deep in the dense undercoat. Had Marnie carried it? Pressed against it? How? Why? The questions screamed in her head, but her hands remained steady, focused on the task. Slowly, painstakingly, she loosened the strands. Marnie remained still, her breathing slightly less frantic now, her eyes drifting shut for seconds at a time. The purr had stopped, replaced by a faint, rhythmic wheeze. Finally, the last stubborn strand gave way. The ring, David's plain, wide, gold wedding band, lay free in Ellie's palm, resting on the damp washcloth. It felt heavy, impossibly heavy, cold from the rain, yet carrying the phantom warmth of David's hand. She stared at it, the familiar scratches on its surface, the slight dent near the edge from the time he'd caught it on a radiator pipe. His. Undeniably his. Lost a year ago, found a year later, delivered by a ghost cat. The symbolism was overwhelming, a message in a language she didn't understand, a cosmic joke, a miracle. Tears blurred her vision again, hot and silent this time. She closed her fingers around it, the metal biting into her palm, a tangible anchor in the storm of her emotions. She tucked it carefully into the pocket of her damp trousers. Later. She would face that later. Marnie needed warmth. Food. Ellie fetched another thick towel, warmed it briefly in the dryer until it was radiating gentle heat, and carefully wrapped it around the shivering cat, cocooning her frail body. Marnie didn't protest, just nestled deeper into the warmth with a tiny, almost inaudible sigh. Ellie then scrambled for the emergency cat food she kept in the back of the cupboard, a single pouch of chicken paste, left over from Marnie's time. She squeezed a small amount onto a saucer, watered it down slightly, and placed it near the bundled towel. The smell of chicken, faint and artificial, filled the small room. Marnie's head lifted, slowly, painfully. Her nose twitched, once, twice. She stared at the saucer, then back at Ellie, uncertainty warring with primal hunger in her sunken eyes. Ellie sat back on her heels, giving space. "It's all right, it's yours," she whispered. "Just a little bit." Minutes ticked by. The rain drummed on the roof. The boiler hummed in the background. Ellie stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Watching. The battle within the tiny, broken body was visible. Instinct screamed food. Survival screamed danger. Trust shattered by a year of who knew. It held her back. Finally, agonizingly slowly, Marnie began to uncurl. She inched forward, an inch, then another, muscles trembling with the effort. Her nose dipped towards the saucer, sniffed cautiously, then withdrew. She looked at Ellie again, a long, searching look. Ellie met her gaze, trying to project calm, safety, home. She blinked slowly, deliberately, the universal cat sign of trust. Marnie watched, unblinking. With a suddenness that made Ellie jump, the cat lowered her head and began to lap frantically at the paste. Tiny, desperate gulps, a low, almost frantic growl vibrating in her throat as she ate. Relief, so profound it felt like weakness, washed over Ellie. She leaned back against the washing machine, the cold metal a shock through her jumper. She watched Marnie eat, the desperate urgency, the visible effort it took. This wasn't her graceful, aloof shadow. This was a creature stripped bare, reduced to its most fundamental needs. And Ellie, she realized with a jolt, felt the same. The year had stripped her too, pared her down to the raw nerves of grief, a hollow woman moving through a hollow house. Marnie's return, this impossible, bedraggled miracle, was the first real thing that had happened in a year. The first spark in the suffocating darkness. But it wasn't joy, not yet. It was a terrifying responsibility. A fragile life placed back in her hands, mirroring her own fragility. The days that followed blurred into a routine of quiet vigilance and slow, tentative steps. Marnie lived in the utility room. Ellie set up a makeshift bed with more towels and a hot water bottle wrapped in fleece, changed frequently. She offered tiny amounts of food every few hours, special recovery paste from the emergency vet visit the next morning, a harrowing journey where Marnie trembled violently in the carrier, the vet's grave expression confirming the severity: severe malnutrition, dehydration, parasites, and a deep, festering wound on her flank Ellie hadn't even noticed under the mud. Medication, syringes of water, gentle cleaning of the wound, it became Ellie's new purpose. Her own grief, the anniversary, receded slightly, not gone, but overshadowed by the immediacy of this small, broken life depending on her. Marnie slept endlessly, curled tightly in her towel nest, a small, breathing stone. When awake, she was watchful. Her eyes followed Ellie's every move within the small room, wide, unreadable. She didn't purr. She rarely made a sound beyond the rasping breath and the tiny clicks when she swallowed her food. Trust was a foreign country, and she was a wary refugee at its border. Ellie talked to her, softly, constantly. Nonsense mostly. The weather. The price of milk. Memories of David, carefully edited. She read aloud from the newspaper sitting on the floor outside the utility room door, so Marnie could get used to her voice without feeling threatened by proximity. The first real breakthrough came on the fourth night. A storm raged outside, fiercer than the one that brought Marnie home. Wind howled around the house. Rain lashed the windows like thrown gravel. Ellie was in the living room, trying to read, but the noise was unsettling. She heard it then, a sound cutting through the gale, not the wind. A low, distressed mew. Faint. Trembling. Coming from the utility room. Ellie hurried in. Marnie was standing, unsteadily, in the middle of her towel nest, her slightly puffed ears flattened. Her eyes were huge, panicked, fixed on the small, high window where the rain hammered relentlessly. The storm, it terrified her. Memories of a year exposed? Of the night she vanished? Ellie's heart clenched. She didn't approach. Instead, she sank slowly to the floor, a few feet away, her back against the washing machine. She started humming, softly, endlessly, an old lullaby her mother used to sing, a shield against the noise outside. She kept her gaze lowered, non-threatening. Minutes passed. The wind shrieked. Marnie remained standing, trembling, her gaze darting between the window and Ellie. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she took a step. Not towards the window, but towards Ellie. Another step. Her legs wobbled. Ellie kept humming, didn't move. Marnie took two more faltering steps, closing the distance. She stopped, just inches from Ellie's outstretched legs. She looked up at Ellie's face, then down at her lap, then back at the storm-rattled window. A low whimper escaped her. The choice was agonizingly clear in her posture, the terrifying unknown of the storm's fury, or the terrifying proximity of the human. She chose the human. With a final, shuddering sigh, Marnie collapsed, not onto Ellie's lap, but onto the floor, pressing her entire thin flank against Ellie's leg, her head resting heavily on Ellie's ankle. The contact was electric, warm, real. Ellie stopped humming. She didn't dare breathe. Marnie's body trembled against her, but it was a different tremor now, less panic, more exhaustion, and perhaps the first flicker of seeking comfort. Ellie slowly, so slowly, lifted her hand, hovered it over the bony back. Marnie didn't flinch, didn't look up, just pressed closer. Ellie lowered her hand, resting it light, feather-light, on the ridge of Marnie's spine. The fur was cleaner now, softer, though still thin. She felt the rapid heartbeat beneath her palm, a tiny, frantic drum against the fragile cage of ribs. And then, it started. Faint at first, barely there, a vibration more felt than heard. Deep within Marnie's chest, a rusty hesitancy. Not the desperate growl of feeding. Not the grating sound from the doorstep. This was different. Thinner, weaker, but unmistakable. A purr of contentment, or at least the absence of terror. Ellie closed her eyes. The storm outside faded to a distant roar. The cold tile beneath her, the ache in her back, none of it mattered. There was only this, the warm weight against her leg, the fragile vibration under her hand, the scent of clean fur and healing. This tiny, broken creature, who had witnessed her deepest sorrow, who had vanished into the abyss, had chosen to press against her for comfort in the storm. The ring felt heavy in her pocket, a cold, hard secret. But this soft warmth, this tentative trust, this was the real miracle. It wasn't about the past, not in that moment. It was about the terrifying, fragile, beautiful beginning of something new, built on the ruins of everything they'd both lost. The purr deepened slightly, settling into a rhythmic thrum against her skin, a lullaby sung by a survivor, a quiet promise whispered in the dark. Ellie rested her head back against the washing machine, her own breath finally easing, and let the warmth seep in. For the first time in a year, the silence of the house wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of a heart, slowly, cautiously, learning to beat again. Both of them. The purr against Ellie's leg, that fragile, resurrected rumble, became the fragile bedrock of their new existence. Weeks bled into a damp, gray November. The relentless rain softened to a constant drizzle, painting the world outside Ellie's windows in shades of charcoal and faded ochre. Inside, the utility room remained Marnie's sanctuary. The hot water bottle was replaced with a proper heated pad. The towels gave way to a soft, fleece-lined bed. The desperate gulps at watered-down paste transformed into careful, deliberate licks at high-calorie recovery food. Then, tentatively, small bites of Real chicken. Marnie filled out, slowly. Not the robust autumn leaf swirl of before, but the terrifying sharpness softened. Fur, meticulously groomed by Ellie with a soft brush, regained a hint of its chaotic luster. The festering wound on her flank closed, leaving a puckered, hairless scar, a brutal map of her year in the wild. Yet, the profound exhaustion lingered. Marnie slept and slept. Deep, heavy sleeps that seemed less like rest and more like a retreat. When awake, her watchfulness remained. She observed Ellie's movements from her bed, those amber eyes tracking her like silent sentinels. Trust grew, but it was a cautious, tentative thing, built in inches, not miles. She allowed Ellie to touch her, gentle strokes along her spine, careful checks of her healing wound. She even began to venture just outside the utility room door, sitting like a small, furry statue on the threshold, surveying the kitchen, the hallway, the living room beyond. But she wouldn't cross. Not yet. The rest of the house, David's house, seemed to hold a weight she wasn't ready to bear. Ellie found herself changing too. The hollow ache was still there, a familiar companion. But it was no longer the only occupant. Tending to Marnie, the meticulous routine of feeding, medicating, cleaning, forced her out of her own inertia. It demanded presence. It demanded life. More, filling the quiet not just for Marnie, but for herself. She started eating proper meals again, at the small kitchen table, instead of picking at toast in the armchair facing the ghost of David's recliner. One afternoon, she even opened the curtains in the living room wide, letting the weak November light flood the space where dust motes had danced undisturbed for months. They felt staring. David's ring, she kept it separate. Not hidden, exactly, but set apart. She'd cleaned it meticulously, removing the last traces of mud in Marnie's ordeal until it gleamed with its own soft, warm light. It now sat in a small, plain china dish on her dresser next to her own wedding band, which she still wore. Seeing them together, his and hers, after a year of his absence, was a physical shock every time. She didn't touch it often, just looked. The questions it carried were too vast, too unsettling. The logistics were baffling. Had Marnie found it at the hospital? Unlikely. Had she somehow retrieved it after vanishing? Impossible. Had David? Ellie's mind shied away from that thought, a superstitious chill running down her spine. The ring felt less like a miracle and more like a silent accusation, a question mark hanging over Marnie's disappearance and her return. The first strange behavior surfaced on a particularly still, fog-bound night. Ellie was reading in the living room, a rare attempt at normalcy, when she heard it. A soft, persistent sound from down the hallway. Not the utility room. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A rhythmic, deliberate scraping. Marnie's door was open. She often sat on the threshold at night. Ellie put her book down, listening. The sound came again. Scratch, 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 but insistent. She got up, padding silently towards the hallway. Marnie wasn't at the utility room door. Ellie followed the sound, her heart starting a slow, uneasy thud. It led her to the closed door of the master bedroom. Ellie hadn't slept in there since David died. It remained frozen, a museum of their life together. His clothes still hung in the wardrobe. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand. The air smelled faintly of dust and forgotten lavender. She'd kept the door shut, a barrier against the crushing weight of memory. Now, the soft scratch, 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 came from the other side. Ellie's hand hovered over the doorknob, cold brass against her palm. She turned it slowly, pushed the door open just a crack. Moonlight, pale and filtered through the fog, spilled in illuminating Marnie. She wasn't trying to get in. She was facing the wall right beside the doorframe, the wall that separated the bedroom from the hallway. Her front paws were raised slightly, and she was methodically, deliberately scratching at the lower part of the wallpaper. Not frantic. Not like a cat trying to sharpen claws. This was focused, almost purposeful. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Her claws caught the old, slightly peeling paper, making a soft, tearing sound. She paused, lowered her head, sniffed intently at the spot, then resumed scratching. "Marnie," Ellie whispered, her voice loud in the profound quiet. "What are you doing, love?" Marnie stopped instantly. Her head whipped around, eyes wide and luminous in the moonlight, fixed on Ellie in the doorway. No guilt, no surprise, just that intense, unwavering stare. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, Marnie turned back to the wall. She lowered her head, sniffed the scratched spot again, a long, deep inhale, then turned and padded silently past Ellie's legs, back towards the utility room. She didn't look back. Ellie stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the patch of wallpaper. In the dim light, she could see the faint marks, tiny parallel grooves in the faded floral pattern. It wasn't the first time. Just the first time she'd witnessed it. A cold finger of unease traced its way down her spine. What was in that wall? Or rather, what did Marnie think was in that wall? Was it some lingering scent from her past life? A mouse? Or something else? Something tied to the impossible journey she'd taken? To the ring? It became a ritual. Not every night, but often. Usually in the deep quiet after midnight. Ellie would hear the soft scratch, scratch. Sometimes she'd creep to the hallway, watching Marnie repeat the same focused action, sniffing, scratching, always that same spot, low on the wall beside the bedroom door. She never tried to enter the room. Never scratched anywhere else. Just that one place. And she'd stop if she sensed Ellie watching, turning to give her that long, unreadable look before retreating. It felt less like a compulsion and more like a message. A message Ellie couldn't decipher. The scratching coincided with another change. Marnie began venturing further. One afternoon, Ellie found her sitting in the exact center of the living room rug, staring at the empty space where David's recliner had been. Her posture wasn't relaxed, but alert, watchful, as if expecting the chair and its occupant to materialize. Another time, Ellie walked into the kitchen to find Marnie standing on her hind legs, front paws resting lightly on the counter, gazing intently out the window towards the old apple tree in the rain-sodden yard. The tree where David had first seen her, a shivering scrap beneath the leaves. She didn't meow, didn't ask for food, just stared, remembering? Ellie found herself increasingly preoccupied. The ring, the scratching, Marnie's silent vigils in spaces heavy with David's absence. It felt like the cat was navigating a map only she could see, a map woven from scent, memory, and something Ellie couldn't grasp. The rational explanations, residual scent, old habits, feline curiosity, felt hollow. Too coincidental. Too laden with the weight of that impossible gold band now gleaming on her dresser. The quiet grief she'd been learning to live alongside began to churn, stirred by a rising tide of questions that had no answers. And guilt. A fresh, sharp guilt she hadn't anticipated. Had Marnie vanished because Ellie, lost in her own ocean of sorrow, had failed her? Had she been out there, suffering, trying to find her way back, or trying to complete some unfathomable task? One rainy afternoon, while Marnie slept deeply in her heated bed, Ellie finally snapped. The scratching, the staring, the silent, accusatory weight of the ring, it coalesced into a suffocating pressure. She needed to know. She marched down the hallway, grabbed a small step stool from the understairs cupboard, and carried it to the spot beside the bedroom door. She set it down, climbed up, and stared at the section of wallpaper Marnie had been methodically damaging. Up close, the tiny claw marks were more evident, concentrated on a patch roughly the size of her hand. The paper was slightly loosened there, curled at one edge where Marnie's persistent attention had worked it free. Ellie ran her fingertips over it. Just old wallpaper, the plaster beneath felt solid. No hollow sound. No hidden compartment. Nothing. Frustration bubbled up, hot and sudden. What was she expecting? A secret note from David? A clue to where Marnie had been? It was just a wall. She pressed her palm flat against the scratched area, closed her eyes, trying to feel something. Anything. Only the cool, unyielding surface of plaster met her touch. The silence of the house pressed in, heavy and mocking. She felt foolish, desperate. Grief, she realized, could make you see patterns where there were none, assign meaning to random events, cling to impossible hopes delivered by skeletal cats and lost wedding rings. She stepped down, dragged the stool away, and leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the bedroom door. Tears pricked her eyes, not the slow, sad tears of missing David, but tears of confusion, of helplessness, of a mystery she couldn't solve. A soft sound made her turn. Marnie stood in the hallway, just a few feet away. She hadn't made a sound approaching. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly, those amber eyes reflecting the dim hall light. No judgment, just observation. and something else, a stillness, a waiting. As if she understood Ellie's frustration, her need to know, and was simply waiting for her to catch up. Ellie wiped her eyes roughly. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "What do you want me to see?" Marnie blinked slowly, deliberately, holding Ellie's gaze. Then, without a sound, she turned and padded back towards the utility room, leaving Ellie alone in the hallway, leaning against the door to a room full of ghosts, staring at a patch of scratched wallpaper that held a secret she couldn't unlock, and a cat whose return felt less like a blessing and more like the quiet, insistent knock of a past that refused to stay buried. The scratching wasn't random. The ring wasn't coincidence. Marnie was trying to tell her something. The question wasn't if anymore. The question was, did Ellie have the courage to break the wall and face what was hidden behind it? The tension coiled in the air, thick as the November fog outside, a silent, unanswered question hanging between the woman and the cat, between the living and the echoes of the lost. The hallway felt narrower after that, the patch of scratched wallpaper a pulsing, silent accusation. Ellie avoided it, walked past it quickly, eyes averted, as if the tiny grooves held the power to unravel her carefully reconstructed composure. Marnie's slow, deliberate blinks, that unnerving stillness as she watched Ellie lean against the bedroom door, echoed in her mind. "What do you want me to see?" The question became a constant hum beneath the surface of her daze, louder than the rain on the roof, more persistent than the ache of David's absence. Marnie continued her rituals. The scratching returned on foggy nights, scratch, scratch, scratch. A metronome of mystery in the dark. Her silent vigils expanded. She'd sit for hours in the living room, not on the rug anymore, but curled in the corner where David's bookshelf stood, her amber eyes fixed on the empty space his chair had occupied. Or she'd stand sentinel at the kitchen window, gazing towards the apple tree, her posture rigid, tail tip twitching minutely, as if tracking movements only she could perceive. Ellie watched her, a knot of frustration and sorrow tightening in her chest. The cat wasn't just back. She was haunted. Haunted by David, by her own vanished year, by a secret etched into her being and now projected onto this house, this wall. David's ring, gleaming softly in its dish, felt less like a miraculous return and more like a burning coal. Ellie found herself picking it up, turning it over in her fingers, tracing the familiar dent near the edge. The cold metal seemed to whisper, "Solve me. Understand." But how? The hospital was a dead end. She'd called months ago when it first vanished. Nothing. The idea that Marnie had found it after vanishing, carried it through a year of unimaginable hardship, it defied logic. It pointed towards something else. Something Ellie couldn't name, a connection that bypassed reason and settled in the realm of feeling, of profound, unsettling resonance. The breaking point came on a night thick with freezing fog. The air inside the house felt brittle, charged with a silent tension. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cooling cup of tea. Marnie was in the hallway. Ellie could feel her presence, that focused energy radiating from near the bedroom door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound wasn't loud, but in the suffocating quiet, it was deafening. Each scrape felt like fingernails dragging across Ellie's raw nerves. Memories flooded her, unbidden. The frantic hospital search for the ring, David's pale hand lying still on the sheet, the crushing silence after the machines stopped, the desolate emptiness when Marnie vanished, the skeletal ghost returning with the impossible treasure, the unblinking stares, the silent question hanging in the air. What do you want me to see? The frustration, the grief, the gnawing, unspeakable guilt that she had somehow failed them both, it erupted. A choked sob escaped her. Then another. Hot tears spilled over, scalding her cheeks. She slammed her fist down on the table, the cup rattling violently. Enough! The word tore from her throat, ragged, shattering the fragile quiet. Just enough. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. The scratching had stopped. Ellie sat hunched over the table, shoulders shaking, breath coming in ragged gasps. The tears weren't gentle now. They were a torrent, a year of dammed-up sorrow and confusion breaking free. She cried for David, for the life stolen too soon. She cried for Marnie, for the year of suffering she must have endured. She cried for herself, for the hollow woman left behind, and for the terrifying responsibility of this fragile, haunted creature who had returned bearing impossible gifts and unanswerable riddles. She cried because the wall was just a wall, and the ring was just a ring, and none of it made sense, and the not knowing was a weight threatening to crush her. A soft sound, not scratching, a faint, almost inaudible click of claws on linoleum. Ellie didn't look up. She couldn't. The storm inside her was too vast. She felt a presence near her leg, a warmth. Then the lightest possible pressure, a soft nudge against her shin. Marnie. She had come. Not fleeing the outburst, but drawn to it. Ellie kept her head buried in her hands, tears dripping onto the worn tablecloth. The nudge came again, slightly more insistent. Then, silence. Ellie risked a glance down, her vision blurred. Marnie sat beside her chair, not touching her now, but looking up. Her amber eyes, huge and luminous in the dim kitchen light, held Ellie's tear-streaked gaze. No fear, no judgment, just a profound, ancient stillness. And in that stillness, Ellie saw it. Not a message, but a reflection. She saw the same bone-deep weariness, the same weight of loss, the same desperate need for understanding that churned within herself. Marnie wasn't just a cat carrying a ring or scratching a wall. She was a survivor, bearing witness to an absence that mirrored Ellie's own. The ring, the scratching, they weren't clues to be solved. They were testaments. Proof of a journey taken, a loyalty that defied death and distance, a connection that had endured even when severed. The realization hit Ellie like a physical blow, stealing her breath. It wasn't about what was in the wall. It was about why Marnie scratched it. That spot, beside the bedroom door, it was where David used to pause every morning before leaving for work. He'd lean his shoulder against the wall, pull on his coat, and often Marnie would twine around his ankles, looking up. Ellie could see it now, vivid as a film reel in her mind. David, smiling down, reaching to scratch Marnie briefly behind her notched ear, right there. It was a place saturated with his scent, his presence, his routine. Marnie hadn't been trying to unearth a hidden object. She'd been trying to unearth a memory. To claw through the layers of time and grief and plaster to reach the scent of her person. The ring, found or carried through hell, was simply the most tangible piece of him she could bring back. A final offering. A proof of love delivered across an impossible chasm. The tears didn't stop, but their nature shifted. The frustration dissolved, replaced by a wave of awe so profound it felt like vertigo. This small creature, this battered survivor, hadn't vanished because Ellie failed her. She'd vanished because her grief was too vast for the empty house. A grief that drove her into the unknown, and then, impossibly, drove her back, carrying the most precious relic she could find. The scratching wasn't a demand. It was a shared language of loss, a desperate attempt to reconnect with the scent map of a vanished world. Ellie slid off the chair, down onto the cold kitchen floor, level with Marnie. She didn't reach out immediately. She just looked, really looked, into those ancient amber eyes. "Oh, Marnie," she breathed, her voice thick with tears and wonder. "My fierce little survivor, my brave, lost shadow, you brought him home." The words weren't about the ring. They were about the love it symbolized, the love Marnie had carried in her tiny, indomitable heart, the love that had guided her back through the storm. Marnie held her gaze, unblinking. Then, slowly, deliberate, she stretched her neck forward, not towards Ellie's hand, but towards her face. She pressed the top of her head, her warm, furry forehead, against Ellie's wet cheek. It was a gesture so small, so simple, yet it carried the weight of a universe, a benediction, an understanding, a silent acknowledgement. "I know your grief. You see mine. We carry him together now." The contact was electric, a current of pure, wordless communion. Ellie closed her eyes, leaning into the soft pressure, feeling the gentle rumble that started deep in Marnie's chest, not the broken engine of the doorstep, not the tentative purr of the utility room storm, but a low, steady, resonant thrum of peace. It vibrated through her cheekbone, down into her own fractured heart, knitting something back together, not perfectly, but stronger in the broken places. They stayed like that for a long time, woman and kid, forehead to cheek, on the cold kitchen floor. The fog pressed against the windows. The house held its breath. The scratched wall waited, but the unbearable tension, the crushing weight of the mystery, had shattered. In its place was a raw, tender clarity. The ring wasn't a question anymore. It was an answer. The wall wasn't a barrier. It was a monument. And Marnie, she wasn't a ghost or a messenger. She was family. A fellow traveler on the long road of loss, who had walked through fire to bring back a piece of the light. The quiet shift Ellie had felt on the doorstep a lifetime ago, that hairline fracture in the ice of her grief, now yawned wide open, flooded with a warmth that was both agonizing and utterly, profoundly healing. The breaking point hadn't broken her. It had broken her open. And in the quiet aftermath, amidst the tears and the purring and the impossible love radiating from a small, scarred creature, Ellie knew what she had to do next. Not for answers, but for remembrance. For the love etched into a scratched wall and carried home in a tangle of muddy fur. She had to see, not with her eyes, blinded by grief and logic, but with her heart, finally open to the miracle. Slowly, she pushed herself up. Her legs felt shaky, but resolute. She walked towards the hallway, towards the bedroom door, towards the patch of wallpaper Marnie had been trying to reach for weeks. This time, she didn't avoid it. This time, she reached out, not to touch the scratches, but to tear the wall down. Ellie's hand hovered over the scratched wallpaper, not avoiding it now, but claiming it. The raw, tender clarity from the kitchen floor still hummed within her, a fragile resonance vibrating alongside Marnie's purr against her cheek. She wasn't tearing down the wall to find a hidden thing, a secret compartment, or even an answer. She was tearing it down to witness, to honor the memory Marnie had clawed towards with such desperate, instinctive devotion. To touch the place David had touched, the place saturated with the ghost of his morning ritual. To make it visible again, not buried under layers of paper and time and grief. She didn't fetch tools. Her fingers found the loosened edge Marnie's claws had worked free. The paper was old, brittle at the seam. It resisted for a second, then tore with a soft, dry rasp. Ellie pulled, slowly, deliberately. A strip peeled away, revealing the plaster beneath, smooth and pale in the dim hallway light. Dust motes danced in the sudden disturbance. She pulled another strip, then another, working methodically around the patch Marnie had focused on. The tearing sound was rhythmic, cathartic, like shedding a skin. Plaster dust coated her fingertips, fine and cool. The scratched area grew, a raw rectangle emerging on the wall beside the bedroom door. Marnie had retreated a few steps, sitting quietly in the hallway, watching. Her amber eyes followed Ellie's movements, intense, but no longer frantic. A quiet anticipation hung in the air. Finally, the scratch section was bare. Ellie stepped back, wiping dusty hands on her jeans. She surveyed the exposed plaster. No hidden messages. No loose bricks. No compartment. Just vault. Smooth, unblemished, except right at shoulder height, where David would have leaned, a faint, almost imperceptible indentation. Not a dent, more like a gentle wear pattern, a subtle softening of the plaster's surface from years of a man's weight resting against it every morning. And beside it, slightly lower, a cluster of tiny, parallel grooves, barely visible scratches in the plaster itself, older, deeper than Marnie's recent efforts. Ellie's breath caught. She moved closer, traced the faint scratches with a dusty fingertip. Her claws, arms, from years ago, when she'd twine around David's ankles as he stood there, her claws occasionally catching the wall in her affectionate weaving. David would laugh, a soft rumble. "Careful, little shadow, you'll bring the house down." The memory surfaced, crystalline, accompanied by the phantom scent of his coffee and pipe tobacco. This was it. The scent map. The memory made manifest. The place where man and cat had connected day after day, in the simple, profound ritual of departure. Marnie hadn't been trying to claw through, she'd been trying to claw back to this exact nexus point of their shared past. The ring, resting heavy in Ellie's pocket now, was the physical token she'd brought back. The wall, this worn patch of plaster, was the altar. Ellie didn't cry. A profound stillness settled over her, deeper than the dust motes drifting in the air. She felt seen, understood, not by logic, but by the raw, wordless language of shared love and shared loss spoken by a small, scarred creature. She turned to Marnie, still sitting patiently. "This is it, isn't it?" Ellie whispered, her voice husky with emotion. "This is where you felt him." Marnie blinked slowly, deliberately, her gaze shifting from Ellie's face to the exposed patch of wall and back. A soft sigh escaped her, a sound of recognition, completion. Then she stood, stretched, and padded silently past Ellie, into the master bedroom. Ellie followed, her heart pounding not with anxiety, but with a quiet awe. Marnie didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the side of the bed David had slept on, the side nearest the window. She sniffed the carpet where his slippers used to sit, then, with a grace that belied her recent fragility, she leapt onto the bed. Not onto the covers, but onto David's pillow. She circled once, twice, a slow, deliberate ritual, then settled, curling herself into a tight, compact circle, right in the center of the pillow's indentation, her head resting where his head had lain for years. Her amber eyes closed. A deep, contented sigh filled the quiet room. She was home, truly home. Not just in the house, but in the heart of David's space, claiming it, consecrating it with her presence. Ellie stood in the doorway. What? The frozen museum of their life together suddenly felt different. Less like a tomb, more like a landscape slowly thawing. The dust wasn't neglect, it was time passing. David's reading glasses on the nightstand weren't a reproach. They were a relic, a beloved artifact. The weight pressing down on her chest, the weight she'd carried since the hospital, shifted. It didn't vanish. David's absence was still a vast, aching space. But the crushing loneliness of that space, the feeling of being the sole mourner in an empty cathedral, it eased. Marnie's presence, her journey, her fierce, enduring loyalty, proved she wasn't alone in carrying him. The cat on his pillow was a testament, a keeper of the flame David had lit in both their lives. Life began to move, subtly, irrevocably changed. Ellie didn't redecorate the bedroom overnight. But she opened the curtains wide the next morning, letting weak November sunlight flood the room for the first time in a year. She started sleeping in the bed again, carefully, respectfully, on her own side. Marnie slept on David's pillow, every night, a small, warm, purring sentinel guarding his memory. The scratching stopped. Completely. The exposed patch of plaster remained, a deliberate scar on the hallway wall, a monument to memory Ellie chose not to cover. She'd touch it sometimes, passing by, feeling the faint wear pattern under her fingertips, the tiny, older scratches. It grounded her, a tactile reminder of love's quiet persistence. Marnie's transformation was gradual, profound. The deep exhaustion began to truly lift. Her naps were lighter, less like retreats and more like rest. She explored the entire house now, not with wary vigilance, but with a quiet confidence. She claimed windowsills, surveyed her domain from the back of the sofa, rediscovered the sunbeam that slanted across the living room rug in the late afternoon. She became Ellie's shadow again, not the ghostly presence of before, but a companion, padding into the kitchen when Ellie cooked, sitting nearby while she read, following her to the door when she left, waiting patiently by the window when she returned. Her purr, once a broken rasp, became a rich, resonant thrum, a constant, comforting vibration in the background of Ellie's days. It wasn't the purr of a kitten, it was the purr of a survivor, deeper, weathered, carrying the echoes of hardship endured and overcome. The ring. Ellie took it out of her pocket. She cleaned the plaster dust from it, held it in her palm alongside her own. His and hers. Together again. Not a puzzle, but a pair. A symbol of a bond that death couldn't sever, because love, it seemed, could travel impossible distances, carried in the heart of a small, determined creature. She didn't wear David's ring. Instead, she found a thin, sturdy silver chain. She threaded his ring onto it and fastened it around her neck. It settled against her skin, cool at first, then warming to her body heat. A hidden weight, a secret comfort, resting just above her own heart. She touched it sometimes, unconsciously, when she thought of him, or when Marnie curled beside her, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible thread connecting them all. Routines shifted, softened. Mornings weren't about facing the ghost chair anymore. They were about feeding Marnie, who now announced breakfast with a soft, chirping trill, and making tea while the cat sat regally on the counter, supervising. Evenings were spent reading. Ellie in her armchair, Marnie often curled on the footstool nearby, or sometimes, tentatively, jumping onto the armrest, leaning her warm body against Ellie's shoulder. The first time she did it, Ellie froze, then slowly, carefully, rested her cheek against the top of Marnie's head, breathing in the clean, warm scent of her fur, feeling the deep, steady purr vibrate through her own bones. It wasn't David's embrace, but it was warmth, it was connection, it was life insisting on continuing. The mystery hadn't vanished. Where had Marnie been? How had she survived? How had she found the ring? These questions still lingered, but they no longer gnawed. They existed in the realm of the miraculous, accepted, like the inexplicable way sunlight finds a crack in storm clouds. The peace wasn't about having answers, it was about accepting the gift, the profound, messy, miraculous gift of Marnie's return. The scar on Marnie's flank, the exposed plaster on the wall, the weight of the ring against Ellie's chest, they were all testaments. Marks of survival. Proof that love could leave scars, but it could also guide you home through the darkest storms. One crisp December morning, weeks later, frost etching delicate patterns on the window panes, Ellie stood by the bay window in the living room, holding a steaming mug. Marnie sat on the windowsill beside her, sleek and solid now, her tortoiseshell fur a vibrant swirl in the pale winter light. She gazed out, not with the rigid intensity of before, but with a calm, watchful curiosity. Ellie followed her gaze to the old apple tree, skeletal branches etched against the gray sky. The place where it all began, where David found a shivering scrap of life huddled beneath the leaves. A small brown bird landed on a frost-rimed branch, fluffed its feathers against the cold. Marnie's tail twitched, once, a flicker of ancient instinct, then stilled. She just watched, peaceful, present. Ellie sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her. The emptiness she'd lived in, that cold, hollow space where warmth used to be, it wasn't gone. David's absence was still a vast, silent room within her. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the soft sound of Marnie's breathing, the deep resonance of her purr, the warmth of her body pressed close, the weight of a gold ring resting against her skin, and the quiet, enduring presence of a love that had defied distance, time, and even death itself to find its way back. The space wasn't filled with what was, but with what remained, and what had miraculously returned. She reached out, not to the empty air, but to rest her hand gently on Marnie's warm back. The purr deepened, a steady, grounding vibration against her palm. Outside, the frost sparkled. Inside, the silence held not echoes, but the soft, resilient hum of a life reclaimed. The shadow had returned, not to haunt, but to heal. And in the quiet companionship of a winter morning, Ellie felt, not whole, but no longer shattered. She was held together by golden threads, visible and invisible, spun by loyalty, and the fierce, enduring love of a little cat who had walked through fire to bring the light back home. Winter deepened its hold, frosting the world outside Ellie's windows into a monochrome etching. Inside, the warmth felt earned, fragile, precious. Marnie's purr was the hearth fire of the house now, a constant, deep-throated rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, settled into Ellie's bones during quiet evenings reading, accompanied the rhythmic chop of vegetables at the kitchen counter. The cat moved with a new grace, a quiet assurance. The sharp angles of starvation were softened by healthy weight. Her tortoise-shell coat, meticulously groomed by Ellie and herself, shone with a chaotic vibrancy, oranges like autumn embers, blacks like polished coal, creams like winter sunlight. The scar on her flank remained, a stark, hairless map of her ordeal, but it was just part of her story now, like the exposed plaster monument in the hallway, like the weight of David's ring resting against Ellie's heart beneath her jumper. Life had settled into a rhythm that held both sorrow and profound gratitude. Ellie started venturing out more, tentative steps back into the world. A coffee with an old friend, hesitant at first, filled with pauses where David's absence hung heavy, but ending with a genuine smile. A trip to the library, choosing books not just to read aloud to Marnie, but for herself. She even joined a quiet gardening club meeting at the community center, drawn, perhaps unconsciously, back to the earth David had loved tending. The small, neglected yard behind the house, dominated by the old apple tree, felt like the next frontier. Not a chore, but a possibility. A place where life, dormant under frost, awaited renewal. One bright, brittle Saturday in late February, the air sharp with the promise of thaw, Ellie decided to tackle the compost bin. It stood neglected in a damp corner near the garden shed, a relic of David's careful recycling of kitchen scraps and garden waste. He'd been passionate about it, layering greens and browns, turning it diligently, producing rich, dark earth for his roses. Ellie hadn't touched it since he died. The lid was crusted with frost and moss. She pulled on David's old gardening gloves, too big, smelling faintly of earth in him, and wrestled the lid open. A plume of cold, damp air escaped, smelling surprisingly sweet, of decomposition paused by winter, of apples long gone, of wet leaves and forgotten tea bags. She began to fork out the frozen, compacted layers, intending to start fresh for spring. It was heavy work, the frost binding the material together. Marnie appeared, as she often did when Ellie was outdoors, sitting regally on the back step, her amber eyes watching the rhythmic motion of the fork, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws. The weak winter sun caught the vibrant swirl of her fur. Ellie talked to her as she worked, about the frozen earth, the stubborn frost, the hope of crocuses. Marnie blinked slowly, a silent, attentive audience. Deep within the bin, near the bottom where the oldest, coldest layers resided, Ellie's fork struck something harder than compost. Not a stone, something smaller, metallic? She frowned, bent closer, carefully forked away the clumped, frozen vegetable matter and coffee grounds. Nestled in the half-frozen, dark sludge was a small, mud-encrusted object. Not David's ring, that was safe against her skin. This was different. Smaller, duller. She reached in, gloved fingers closing around it. It was cold, slimy. She pulled it free, wiped it on the leg of her jeans, held it up to the weak sunlight. A button. A small, plain, brass button. Utterly ordinary. But Ellie's breath caught. She knew this button. It was from David's favorite cardigan, the thick, cable-knit one he wore constantly in the house during colder months. The one he'd been wearing that day. The day they'd rushed to the hospital, the frantic blur, the long vigil, the crushing silence. She'd packed the cardigan away months later, unable to bear its empty shape, its lingering scent. She must have missed this button falling off, lost in the chaos, swept up with kitchen scraps, finding its way into the compost bin David had last tended. It was such a small thing. Insignificant. Yet, holding it, the cold brass biting through the worn glove fabric, felt like touching a live wire to a specific, sharp memory. David, smiling faintly, pale but trying to reassure her in the harsh hospital light, fiddling unconsciously with that very button on his cardigan. A gesture of nervousness, of love, of holding on to the familiar in an unfamiliar, terrifying place. The man had been there, witness to it, forgot, frozen into it, just like the ring, just like Marnie. Ellie sank back onto her heels, right there in the frosty mud beside the compost bin, the tiny button clutched in her gloved hand. She looked at Marnie, sitting peacefully on the step, watching her. The cat's gaze was calm, knowing, as if she'd expected this. As if she understood the archaeology of loss Ellie was unearthing. The ring had been a grand, impossible gesture, a beacon carried across a dark year. This button, this was a whisper. A tiny, intimate fragment of the ordinary life that had been ripped away, preserved in the earth David loved, waiting to be found. Not by Marnie this time, but by Ellie, guided, perhaps, by the quiet presence of the cat who had shown her how to look, how to remember, how to find meaning in the fragments. Tears welled, not the wrenching sobs of the kitchen floor, but quiet tears of recognition. Of the intricate, invisible tapestry connecting them all: David, Ellie, Marnie, the ring, the wall, the compost bin, this tiny button. Each piece a testament, a thread in the story of love, loss, and improbable return. Marnie hadn't just brought back David's ring, she'd brought back Ellie's ability to see, to find David not just in grand gestures, but in the small, ordinary relics of their shared life. The button wasn't just a button, it was the nervous fidget of his hand, the warmth of his cardigan, the quiet comfort of evenings by the fire. Later, after washing the button meticulously, Ellie placed it not with the rings, but in the small china dish beside them. A trio of relics now, the symbol of their union, her ring, the symbol of return and enduring love, his ring, and the symbol of the ordinary, precious life they built, the button. Marnie sat on the dresser, watching her arrange them, her purr a soft counterpoint to the quiet click of porcelain. The discovery spurred Ellie into action. David's neglected garden, their neglected garden, called to her. She spent days clearing frost-rimed weeds from the small rose bed David had cherished, the one beneath the kitchen window where Marnie often sat surveying her domain. The earth was hard, unyielding, but Ellie worked it with a quiet determination she hadn't felt in years. Marnie supervised, sometimes from the windowsill, sometimes venturing out to sit nearby on a cleared patch, watching the rhythmic plunge of the spade, the scattering of rich, dark compost from the bin she'd finally emptied and renewed. The compost that had held the button, the frozen remnants of their old life, now nourishing the earth for new growth. The symbolism wasn't lost on Ellie. Life feeding life. Memory nurturing the future. She ordered rose bushes. Not the fancy hybrids David sometimes favored, but old, hardy varieties with deep, complex scents and names that sounded like poems. Munstead Wood, Gertrude Jekyll, William Shakespeare 2000. Bushes that promised resilience and enduring beauty. Planting them in the cold earth felt like an act of faith, a covenant with the spring to come, and with the memory of the man who had taught her to love the quiet magic of things growing. On the day she planted the last rose, a pale yellow Graham Thomas chosen for its sunshine hue, a strange thing happened. A gust of wind, warmer than any they'd felt in months, swept through the yard. It rustled the bare branches of the apple tree, sent a flurry of last year's dead leaves skittering across the newly turned earth, and plucked something small and delicate from the pocket of David's old gardening coat, which Ellie had worn. Fluttered, a tiny, dried, crumpled thing, landing right on the freshly planted rose bush. Ellie bent to pick it up. It was a single, withered petal, deep, velvety crimson, almost black with age. A rose petal. From one of the roses. Ellie realized with a jolt, from the bouquet she'd brought to David's funeral. She must have tucked it into his coat pocket a lifetime ago, a final, silent offering, forgotten. Preserved by the cold, carried through the winter, and returned to her now, by the wind, on the day she planted new roses in his memory. She held the fragile petal in her palm, its color a ghost of its former glory, its texture papery thin. Marnie patted over, sniffed it curiously, then looked up at Ellie, her amber eyes reflecting the pale winter sky. Ellie didn't speak. Words felt inadequate. The petal, the button, the ring, the scar, the exposed plaster, the purring cat, the newly planted roses, they were all verses in the same silent poem. A poem about how love leaves its mark in grand gestures and tiny fragments, in scars and in healing, in things lost and miraculously found, in endings that somehow, impossibly, nourish beginnings. She knelt in the cool earth beside the Graham Thomas rose, the withered crimson petal resting on her palm, Marnie warm against her leg. She looked at the cat, then at the petal, then at the freshly turned soil holding the promise of yellow blooms. The message wasn't delivered by a ghost or written in plaster dust. It was written in the language of resilience, in the quiet persistence of life, in the enduring echo of love that refused to be buried, even when it seemed lost forever. It whispered that David wasn't truly gone, not as long as she remembered the feel of his cardigan button, not as long as she wore his ring, not as long as his little shadow purred beside her, and not as long as roses bloomed in the garden he'd loved, fed by the compost of their shared past. The final gift wasn't the ring, or the button, or even Marnie herself. The final gift was the understanding, the profound, quiet certainty that love, like the roses, could sleep deep in the frozen earth and rise again, transformed, but undeniably, beautifully alive. Ellie closed her fingers gently around the ancient petal, not to crush it, but to hold its essence, a silent haiku written by the wind and the years. Love buried deep, still feeds new roots, still blooms. Spring arrived not with a fanfare, but with a slow, tender unfurling. The frost relinquished its grip, inch by thawing inch. Pale green shoots, impossibly brave, pierced the cold earth in Ellie's garden. The Munsteadwood rose showed tiny, crimson-tinged leaves. The Gertrude Jekyll boasted fierce thorns and promise. The Graham Thomas held its buds close, guarding its future sunshine. The air lost its winter bite, carrying instead the damp, fecund scent of awakening earth, and beneath it, the faint, hopeful perfume of the apple tree's first blossoms. Delicate white petals, like scattered confetti, dusted the newly turned soil and caught in Marnie's fur as she patrolled her burgeoning kingdom. Life within the house had settled into a rhythm woven with memory and the quiet joy of the present. The exposed plaster in the hallway, the tactile monument to David's morning ritual and Marnie's devotion, was no longer a raw wound. It was simply a familiar landmark. Ellie touched it less often now, not out of avoidance, but because its message was internalized. David's ring, no longer hidden, hung openly on its silver chain around her neck, catching the light when she moved, a warm weight against her skin. Her own ring sat beside it on her finger, a pair reunited, symbols not just of what was lost, but of what endured. The tiny brass button rested in the china dish on the dresser, a quiet sentinel of ordinary love. The withered crimson petal, too fragile to keep, Ellie had pressed between the pages of David's old botany book, a ghost preserved beside his careful notes on rose cultivation. Marnie, her transformation felt complete. The skeleton was gone, replaced by a sturdy, muscular grace. Her tortoise-shell coat, vibrant and meticulously groomed, shone in the spring sunlight. The scar on her flank remained, a stark, hairless valley, but Ellie no longer saw just the wound. She saw the map of survival, a badge of honor earned in the crucible of a year lost and found. Marnie moved through the house and garden with a serene confidence, a queen surveying a realm reclaimed. Her purport, that deep, resonant thrum, was the soundtrack of Ellie's days, a vibration of pure contentment that seemed to emanate from a core of profound peace. She was Ellie's shadow once more, but a shadow filled with light. Curled beside her on the sofa as Ellie read, perched on the windowsill, tail twitching at sparrows, greeting her at the door with a soft trill that held no trace of the rasp from the doorstep storm. She still slept on David's pillow, a small, warm custodian of his memory. But she also claimed Ellie's lap now, pressing her warm weight against her, purring like a contented engine, a tangible, living comfort. The garden became Ellie's sanctuary, her conversation with the past and her promise to the future. Tending the roses, weeding the fledgling beds, turning the compost that now held only new scraps and the rich potential of renewal, it grounded her. She felt David's presence there, not as a ghost, but as an echo in the rustle of leaves, in the scent of damp earth, in the satisfaction of nurturing life. She talked to him sometimes, softly, as she worked, telling him about the buds on Gertrude, about the cheeky robin that followed her, about Marnie's latest sunbeam conquest. It wasn't desperate pleading into the void anymore. It was sharing, keeping him part of the life that was stubbornly, beautifully, continuing. One bright April morning, the air sweet with apple blossom and the promise of warmth, Ellie was kneeling beside the William Shakespeare 2000 rose, carefully loosening the soil around its base. Marnie sat nearby on the newly scrubbed back step, bathing meticulously, her fur catching the sun like stained glass. A movement at the garden gate made Ellie look up. Miss Henderson, her elderly neighbor from 2 doors down, stood there, leaning on her walking stick. Her face, usually etched with its own quiet loneliness, held a hesitant smile. "Ellie, love," she called, her voice thin but warm. "Those roses, they're coming along a treat. David would be that proud." Ellie felt a familiar lump rise in her throat, but it was softer now, wrapped in gratitude. She stood, brushing dirt from David's old gardening gloves. "Thank you, Mrs. H, trying my best." He left big shoes to fill, or rather, big gardening gloves. She held up a gloved hand, smiling faintly. Mrs. Henderson chuckled. He did that. Spent hours out here, he did. Always had time for a chat over the fence." Her gaze drifted to Marnie, now watching her with calm, amber eyes. "And this must be the famous Marnie? Heard tell she came back. Like a little miracle, they're saying." Ellie looked at Marnie, the cat serene, regal, a living testament to impossible journeys. "She is," Ellie said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "She really is." Mrs. Henderson's eyes grew distant, moist. "Lost my Bert, 5 years come June. Had a cat to Smokey, big old Tom. Disappeared not long after Bert passed. Just gone." She blinked rapidly, looking down at her hands gripping the walking stick. "Never found him. Always wondered. Hoped, you know." Ellie walked towards the gate, Marnie rising smoothly to pad silently beside her. She reached out, placing a dirt-smudged hand gently over Mrs. Henderson's wrinkled one where it rested on the gate. "I know," she whispered. The shared language of loss, of unanswered questions, hung between them. Marnie sat at Ellie's feet, looking up at the old woman, then deliberately, slowly blinked. That universal sign of feline trust, of peace. Mrs. Henderson's breath hitched. A tear escaped, tracing a path down her weathered cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She looked from Marnie to Ellie, and a different kind of smile, fragile but real, touched her lips. Maybe they find their way," she murmured. "Maybe they just know when we need reminding." Ellie squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe they do, Mrs. H, maybe they do." That small exchange, that moment of shared understanding sparked by a purring cat blinking in the spring sunshine, ignited something in Ellie. She started spending more time in the garden, not just working, but sitting. on an old, rickety bench David had salvaged years ago, now placed beneath the apple tree. She'd drink her tea there, watch the roses grow, feel Marnie's warm weight pressed against her leg. Neighbors walking past would stop to chat, drawn by the burgeoning beauty, and often by the sight of the little tortoiseshell cat who'd performed the impossible. Ellie found herself sharing not just gardening tips, but fragments of her story. Of David, of the crushing silence, of the rain-lashed night Marnie returned, skeletal, bearing the impossible weight of a lost wedding ring. She spoke of the scratched wall, the revelation, the button in the compost, the petal on the wind. She spoke of the slow, painful, beautiful journey back to life. People listened, not with pity, but with a kind of awe and recognition. They shared their own stories, of loss, of pets who'd vanished or passed, of small, inexplicable comforts that had kept them going. The garden bench beneath the blossoming apple tree became an unofficial sanctuary, a place where grief wasn't hidden, but shared, acknowledged, and softened by the simple presence of growing things, and a small cat who embodied resilience. Marnie, seemingly understanding her role, would often grace these gatherings. She'd allow a gentle stroke, blink slowly at a tearful neighbor, or simply sit regally on the bench, her purr a soothing undercurrent to the murmured conversations. She was a silent therapist, a furry testament to second chances, a living bridge between sorrow and hope. One warm May afternoon, the roses finally blooming in a riot of color and scent, Ellie sat on the bench. Marnie was sprawled luxuriously beside her, belly exposed to the sun, purring like a contented bumblebee. Munstead Wood's deep plum blooms released their intoxicating old rose perfume. Gertrude Jekyll was a cloud of blushing pink. Graham Thomas beamed pure, sunshine yellow. The apple blossoms had mostly fallen, carpeting the ground in white, making way for tiny, nascent fruit. Ellie touched the rings at her neck, warm from her skin. She looked at the vibrant garden, a testament to love remembered and life renewed. She looked at Marnie, her fierce little survivor, her unexpected salvation, her furry anchor. The shadow hadn't just returned, she had become the light. The universal truth of the story wasn't shouted, it whispered on the fragrant breeze, resonated in Marnie's purr, bloomed in the defiant beauty of the roses fed by the compost of the past. It was simple, profound, and achingly human. Love doesn't die with the last breath. It endures. It transforms. It hides in the frozen earth, in lost trinkets, in the wild heart of a missing cat, waiting for the thaw. It guides lost souls home, across stormy nights and impossible distances. And sometimes, the most profound acts of love, the ones that mend shattered worlds, arrive not with grand declarations, but on silent paws, bearing the weight of a single, impossible token and the fierce, unwavering loyalty of a survivor's heart. Grief leaves scars, but scars are just maps of where we've been, not boundaries to where we can go. Healing isn't forgetting, it's weaving the threads of loss into the fabric of a life that continues, finding beauty in the mended places, strength in the echoes of love. Ellie closed her eyes, breathing in the rose-scented air, feeling the sun warm on her face, the solid, purring warmth of Marnie against her side. The hollow space beneath her ribs, the one where warmth used to be, wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the scent of David's roses, the sound of Marnie's purr, the weight of his ring against her skin, the memory of his laugh trapped not in the beams, but in the rustle of apple leaves, and the quiet, enduring certainty that love, true love, is a force that not even death can fully extinguish. It simply changes form, finds new vessels, whispers on the wind, blooms in unexpected places, and sometimes returns exactly 1 year after disappearing, with a wedding ring and a lesson written in resilience that mends the broken world, one pearl, one petal, one precious, ordinary moment at a time. The story wasn't about an ending, but about the quiet, ongoing echo of a love that had chosen, against all odds, to remain. And so, beneath the blossoms, beside the roses, with a purring testament to miracles curled warm against her, Ellie found not an ending, but a beautiful, bittersweet beginning. A life rebuilt not despite the loss, but woven through it, golden threads of memory binding the past to a present filled with quiet wonder. The greatest gift wasn't the return, but the profound understanding that love, once given, is never truly lost. It endures. It transforms. It finds its way home. Before you go, if Marnie's journey, her fierce loyalty, and the quiet miracle of her return touched your heart like it did ours, please show some love. Smash that like button. It lets us know these stories matter. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our daily tales of hope, healing, and the extraordinary bonds we share with our furry companions. We pour our hearts into these true stories, and your support means everything. Tell us in the comments below, where in the world are you listening from? Is there a special animal who helped you through a storm? Share your story. We read every single one. Thank you for being part of our story-loving family. Until next time, hold your loved ones close, both two-legged and four, because sometimes the most powerful magic arrives on silent paws. Goodbye for now.